Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today to this performance review webinar. It's kind of introductory webinar for those involved with the process this academic year. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Jamie Hunt. I'm Education Lead at the HCPC. And I'll be taking you through a series of slides today, which kind of go through at a high level the model and what we're looking to achieve, and then also a bit more detail about what to expect from the performance review process, the kinds of things that you can expect in your interactions with us, what we're asking you to do, and some guidance really about how to make a success of the process when you're interacting with it. As I noted, you can't kind of contribute today via your voice. I can't hear you and I can't see you, but we do have a chat box in which you can post questions, and there's a Q&A session where I'll come to those questions at the end and try to answer as best I can. So please drop questions into the chat box as we go, and then I'll kind of have a look through them at the end to answer questions. Okay, so firstly, I just wanted to go through the kind of the model aim and key features. So we've introduced a new education quality assurance model. That model launched in September, and our aim with that is to position our education functions and what we do in the education function, the HCPC, to be flexible, intelligent, and data-led in our quality assurance of institutions and programs. We have some key features of the model that are in those 4 boxes there that help us to achieve that. So we undertake assessment of provision at the institution level and the program level separately, so we separate those out now wherever we can. The performance review process very much focuses on the institution and wherever possible, and then it delves into professional detail where we need to. And we split our standards to support that approach, so making sure that we can have some standards that sit at the institution level and there's some separate standards that sit at the program level. We try and be flexible wherever we can, so we don't want to just run processes that are linear, that do things that we don't need to do each time. So we try and apply flexible processes, design those processes so that we can essentially address the things that are important in regard to that education provider, that program, that assessment. So rather than doing the same things with everybody, we design our processes to ensure that we can be flexible and proportionate in our approach. We also use data and intelligence, so much more formally embedding data and intelligence points into the work that we do as part of the evidence that we use. Very much that should be considered as part of the evidence, and I will come back to talk about data in a little bit more detail through this session. And we also have a regional approach, so I'm sure many of you all know now you have a regional contact. So we have 5 education officers within our team, and they all have regions within the UK that they look after. They're now experts within those regions, and they'll help you to essentially to understand what you're doing. We want to understand what you're doing, and we think it's really important that you understand what we're doing as well, and to make sure that we all kind of come together and we are working on the right things, the important things, that we understand what's important to each of us. So you have those regional leads and those regional contacts. They're the people that will be leading your performance review kind of assessments this year, yeah, we'll kind of keep working with you in that way, moving forward to make sure that we can share information well and understand what's happening really and what's important to you. So how the new model looks and feels. So we still run an approval process. We assess institutions more formally through that process now, and also programs to ensure that they all meet standards to deliver individuals that meet proficiency standards. We also have what we're calling the kind of the light blue bubble. There is a focused review, and that essentially allows us to engage with providers and their programs when we need to understand something that's happening. So if we hear of something, a provider raises as something that might affect the quality of the provision, we might need to explore that, and we do that through a focused review process, which is very kind of bespokely designed when we interact with education providers. And the process that we're here to talk about today is the performance review process. So that's periodic engagement with institutions to understand the performance and the quality of their provision. So that moves us away from the space that we used to be in with the annual monitoring process from our legacy model, which many of you will have interacted with, which was much more compliance focused, a list of standards, how you go about, if you have made changes in relation to any of those standards, then evidencing those changes. So we very much have moved away from that kind of compliance-based model to asking you to self-reflect around a list of key areas, so that we can understand how you are performing, and then that allows us to make some decisions around our standards, but also around what we need to do next with you, and whether we'd be confident to not need to monitor you as frequently as we did. So I just wanted to mention in a bit more detail that regional approach. So our team members they are empowered to build and sustain good working relationships with education providers and others. And we want to ensure that we are developing the way that we work with education providers. So dedicated contact, like I was saying, plugging into different parts of the UK and really understand what's happening. So we want to plug in with people like you, with education providers, but also with commissioning organisations, with professional bodies, and with others around the country to ensure that we are getting a really good understanding and a feeling for what's going on out there, so that we can inform the work that we're doing, and vice versa, so that you can inform our work, so that we essentially can all pull in the same direction for good quality provision and help each other to achieve that. So some benefits of the new approach. So we apply right touch regulation. So that means that our model meets our needs, meets other stakeholder needs in a proportionate way, and it helps us to identify and focus on the areas that we really need to. So what are the risky areas? Where are the risky providers? To kind of focus our attention on, and enables us to take our hands off the less risky areas and less risky providers. And so we also want to be able to identify and report on what's working well. So ensuring that regulatory processes add value for education providers, applying a reduced level of scrutiny wherever we can, where that kind of risk assessment allows. And we also just don't want to stand in the way of what's happening. So we don't want to block sectoral initiatives. We want to move away from that one size fits all, and we have moved away from that one size fits all model, as I've been saying here, to a more relationships-led approach at the institution level. So understanding what's important at your institution, understanding how your institution is performing, and ultimately that leads to some things like reducing timescales for approving new provision. If you're running lots of provision, you're doing it well, do we need to take 9 months, and do we need to come and visit you? The answer to that question is no, not really, and we can take a lot of assurance from what's happened in the past. Okay, so what to expect from performance review? So provider selection. We've essentially decided that all education providers will be assessed prior to September 2024. And we've, so there's 3 academic years in which we're working to assess every education provider. That's about 130 providers. And so in order to kind of come to some decisions here, we use some metrics about how metrics and indicators when considering who we needed to prioritise, so who to engage in the first academic year. So those are they're available. There's a paper that's on our website that went to our November Education and Training Committee, and I believe linked to that from your sort of invite email that we sent to you at the very start of the process. But there were the kind of the key factors were the total number of learners, preferring education providers with a high number of learners. We also considered when you were most recently assessed, so when we undertook annual monitoring with you, and preferring providers that we'd assessed longer ago. We also then looked at the kind of the number of available data points. So we set out some data points, which I'll go through in a bit more detail a bit later, and then also what those data points kind of resulted in really through our performance scoring model, and that overall performance score that we produce out of some data points. Now, data is data, and I will come back to how we use that data a little bit later, because it's certainly not the be all and end all. It's not the thing we use to underpin assessments. It's used as a part of a package of evidence when we're undertaking assessments with education providers. So we use those metrics not to make a judgment on the quality of provision, but rather we've used that as a risk assessment to prioritise education providers. So we decided to use those metrics to prioritise, and that this approach went through a really rigorous internal and governance scrutiny. As I say, that decision was made in public as well. Now we're not going to change the priority of education providers, so if you've been selected in this year, then we are going to run through the performance review process with you this year. High-level process steps. So today I'm focusing really on the portfolio preparation step here. So that's the first step here. But there are 5 main kind of high-level steps to this process. And the first one is you preparing a portfolio around the thematic points that we put out to you. We then undertake a quality review of that with some partners, our partner experts, our service user expert advisor, and also some professional experts. We then undertake some quality activity based on our findings from our quality review. We then write a report based on that activity, and then we come to some findings at the end. And then there's a dotted line there that kind of ticks back round to the start, because essentially what we then do is we then continually review data and intelligence until your next review point, so that we can continue to take confidence that your provider is performing as it needs to be. As I say, I'm going to focus on the portfolio preparation part of that at the moment, because that's the most important part to each of you as you're putting your portfolios together. Some key points for interacting with the process. So this is a self-reflective process. We're asking you to focus on performance and quality, and that's the thing that we'll be making judgments around as well. So that moves away from that kind of granular, how are you meeting standard X, how are you meeting standard Y, have you made any changes in those areas and what do they mean? We're certainly now focused much around performance and quality. So what we want to understand is, how are you performing? So it's not just these are the changes we've made. It's not just these are the problems we've encountered. It's I suppose the aim that I'd push you all to kind of think about really is what you want to be able to do here is show the HCPC that you are performing well and how you are performing well as an institution. And then what that will allow us to do is to make a decision that we don't need to interact with you directly as frequently as we did in the previous model. So what we'd like to be able to do is to make judgments that we don't need to interact with you over a 5-year period. So to be able to come back to you again in 5 years, and in that time we'd regularly review data points, and we'd come to you with any questions that we have. But what we'd like to be able to do is to reduce the amount of reduce the number of portfolios and the frequency of the portfolios that we ask you to kind of put in place. So we're not reviewing changes to the standards. We also ask you to provide those reflections as an institution. So that is what we're defining institution as is the whole education provider, I suppose. So if you deliver 10 HCPC approved professions or 1 HCPC approved profession, we ask that you respond with across all of those professions that you run. And so we appreciate that some of those areas may sit in different schools and different faculties, and it'll be up to you to think about how you draw those together, so that you can provide one portfolio submission, delving into the professional detail where you need to. So there are some specific sections where we ask you to delve into professional detail. We produce a quality summary as part of this. That's a quality summary. It's not just an exceptions-based report. So it's not just these are the problems and the provider fixed them, which is what the old reports used to look like. So the intention of these reports is that it really shows how you are performing as an institution against those areas from the portfolio. And it will take, we think, about 4 months, this process. So that's from the point at which you submit your portfolio for us to be able to take through all of those steps in the previous slide, and to come to some conclusions. So that's what we're aiming for, and that's what our kind of service level, I suppose, for this is. And that's broken down further, and we'll explain to you how those timings work as you progress through kind of your individual processes with people. So changing burden here. So I think it's fair to say that there is a shifting focus away from the professional level, away from the program level, from that kind of granular yearly interactions through monitoring and triggering major changes whenever you see fit, to that kind of one self-reflective portfolio for the whole institution. So that obviously requires a change in focus from you. Now, the portfolio that you put together will probably take more effort than a program level monitoring return, but I would say that's offset then by the need to not engage on a continual basis, so to not submit major changes to us, and to not, if you're a larger provider, to not have to submit 10, 15, 20 of those individual program level monitoring returns. But also, if you perform well through this, so there's a real incentive to perform well, which allows us to lengthen the time between submissions, which then reduces that burden further. So what we'd like to reach the position with you would be to to receive a portfolio from you once every 5 years, which then we do a detailed review of, and we'd work with you in that time, but then to not need to interact with you in that kind of following 5-year period. So an early adopter view here. So we undertook a pilot of this new education quality assurance model, and the University of Essex were one of the education providers involved in that pilot. And Chris Green has given us some a quote here, which we'll share these slides after the event, and you can read at your own leisure. I think the main things that I want to pick out is that here, Chris noted that it's reduced the administrative burden for them, but as long as the record keeping internally was good, they did need to draw quite a bit of stuff together. They were also really happy that it allowed them to sort of demonstrate how they were enhancing quality rather than just kind of applying a baseline. Well, this is what we're doing, from a more of a compliance or change perspective. And he noted that it fit more appropriately with their the policies that they already use internally around quality assurance and enhancement, and so it linked in nicely with those processes. So the focus today is around 3 kind of main areas that we're asking you to complete and return to us. So the first is establishing the institution baseline. The second is self-reflecting on those thematic areas. And the third is around data points and data supply. And through each of these, so I'm breaking them down. There's a couple of slides, two or three slides on each. In each of these, what I'm going to try and do is focus on the purpose of that portfolio area or part of the portfolio that we're asking you to return. I'm then going to focus on the process by which you would return something to us, what you'd need to do in order to do that internally and with us, and then give you an example of how that might look and work. So the first one will be around establishing the institution baseline. So what this does for us, and what we mean by institution baseline, is that there's a starting point really to understand your provision. So we're confident each of you are approved providers, you run approved programs, we've assessed those programs in the past. So we're confident that you meet the standards, that you meet program level standards and also the institution level standards based on previous assessments. So when we approved your provision, when we last reviewed it through monitoring and through major change in the legacy model. What we now need you to do, though, is set those institution level approaches out in a really clear way, so that in the future we can refer back to them. So what we ask you to do is establish that baseline. That's a very kind of high level establishing of that baseline. So what we'll ask you to do is to define how you do things like allow your learners to make complaints. To set out how your interprofessional education policies and procedures function at a high level, and then what that allows us to do is when you next propose something new, so you propose a new program to us, when we receive a complaint, for example, or a concern from a member of the public or a student, or if there's something significant that you decide to do that we need to become involved from a regulatory perspective, if you decide to make some significant change. Having that baseline allows us to understand your intentions around IPL, around service user and care involvement, around some stuff around emissions, and to understand then how your new provision slots in with that, to understand what your intentions are and what might have gone wrong. So, for example, if there's a student coming to us with a concern, So what that allows us to do is to have that understanding of that baseline point, and then to use that to build upon when undertaking assessments within the future. Now, as I said, we're confident that you meet those standards. We don't need a load of evidence. We're not asking you for evidence actually here. We're asking you to lay out policies and then to describe briefly how those policies apply at your institution. And this is a point at which we would then ask you as well if you did something differently. So, you know, for your psychology programs, you do one thing in terms of interprofessional education, and for your allied health programs, you do something different for interprofessional education. That's okay. You can just note two approaches through your baselining exercise. So this shouldn't be a huge task. It should be about drawing together what you already have and what you've already supplied to us in the past, and just stating the way that you approach, you know, these key areas that are listed through your portfolio document. And it may be possible that there is a small number of education providers where we're not asking for this, and that might be because you've already completed it. So if that part is missing from your form, don't panic, it's because we've already got it. So the kind of the step-by-step guide that I would ask here, it's just a couple of steps really, it's that firstly you need to make sure that you're providing a response on behalf of the whole institution. So that's every program that's listed on your document, on your portfolio document, and that we ask that you complete that form with a level of detail that it's useful for us to understand how your institution functions. So actually, would somebody new to this understand, you know, at a high level, well, this is how we run service user and care involvement, this is how we run into professional education. What I'd ask that you do is focus on cross-institution approaches, and also note where those approaches differ, as I've already mentioned as well. We are looking for brief explainers rather than you know, pages and pages or paragraphs. You know, 4 or 5 bullet points for each will probably suffice. It is very much a high-level view of how you are approaching these areas that we're asking you to lay out. And kind of a theme running through all of this actually is you've got a named contact at the HCPC. There'll be your regular, you know, consistent named contacts. So please seek advice from us. If you think, you know what, I think I'm maybe providing not enough detail or too much detail, whatever it might be, or I don't know how to focus this particular section, just ask and we'll be able to give you a steer. This is a kind of example from the form. So I've just kind of put some bubbles in here which should help to explain a little bit. So what we have done kind of on the kind of third column there is we've linked to relevant sets wherever we can. Get my laser pointer out. We've linked to relevant sets wherever we can through this document. So it's a really kind of clear link to standards. This might help you to undertake, you know, if you've done some mapping for us previously, it might help you to kind of think, well, what were the HCPC happy with before? So you may that might be a useful kind of starting point. We'd also ask you to list relevant policies. The word list there is crucial. You don't need to supply links, or you don't need to give us evidence through this part of the form. So you know, you can say, we have this policy or this set of policies that links to interprofessional education. This is what they're called. Don't need to supply links to them. You don't need to supply those documents to us in form of evidence. But we do ask you to just briefly describe how the policy and procedure applies or functions at your institution. So there are a couple of examples there about the level of detail that would be useful on the slide. Self-reflection on thematic areas. So this is probably the bigger sort of meatier part of the portfolio, and that we'd you know, that we're asking you to complete. So the purpose of this, so the purpose of the whole I suppose process is that we're you know, engaging with you to understand your performance, like I've mentioned. What we want to do is you know, gain assurance about your continued alignment to our standards. So our standards are still underpinning and fundamental here. What we will be doing, and what we're asking you to do through the kind of this part of the portfolio, the thematic areas part of the portfolio, is to consider your performance against the key themes that we've noted. We will then decide on what we need to explore further, use information that you give to decide what we need to explore further, then develop out any next kind of formal steps for assessment, including the quality activity that we'll undertake. And quality activity might look like, you know, meetings with particular people. We might ask for further evidence. We might ask for clarification via email. We might ask for a range of things across those kinds of areas. So, you know, to explore some of the things that we pick out when assessing your responses to the quality themes. And then using all that information, the information out of the quality activity, information from your portfolio, we would then make a decision about your performance and whether any further action is required, and also then when your next monitoring submission would be due. So the process from your perspective here is that you need to have a think. So what we've done internally is we've looked at we have a list of themes that are kind of a standard list. What we've then done is reviewed that list against your provider type on an individual basis. So we've looked at your provider type and also the region in which you're working. So for example, we're asking education providers in England to provide some self-reflection around apprenticeships, because that's an English initiative, degree apprenticeships, higher degree apprenticeships. We're not asking that of providers in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, because it doesn't apply in those countries. And similarly, we've tried to do that with the type of provider. So actually that there are some things that apply to HEIs that don't apply to non-HEIs, and we regulate across a large range of providers and different types of training. So what we try to do is to design a bespoke portfolio for you with what we know about your institution and what we understand of your institution. However, we're not always going to have got that absolutely right. So the first kind of step I think that you need to be undertaking really is just to consider the areas that we've asked you to evidence through your form, through the bespoke form that we've provided to you. If you think that there are areas that aren't applicable, then get in touch with us and we can discuss those. It might be that that they are applicable. We just need to explain them a bit differently. We need to think about them a bit differently for your institution. But certainly a discussion is a kind of a good first port of call if you don't understand any of those things that we're asking you to do, or if you think, that doesn't really apply to my institution for these reasons. We'll then kind of confirm what we do need from you, and then we ask that you complete that portfolio. So that's completing the actual the prose part of it, I suppose, the self-reflective part of it, and also providing any supporting evidence that you would like to give us. From a supporting evidence perspective, I think it's probably important just that you don't give us loads of supporting evidence. If you can draw out extracts, provide extracts of documentation where you can. You're fine to provide quotes, that sort of stuff. Don't just think this might be useful for them, so I'm just going to give it to them. Please only give us information that you are actually, that is supporting of your position through that. Then we ask, and this is a really kind of crucial part, the last thing that you do before you submit to us is undertake an internal quality checking exercise, focusing on the usability of the portfolio. So make sure that the portfolio works, that somebody can review it, can pick it up, can understand it, and to try to think about it from an external perspective. So that's simple stuff like making sure links work, but it's also slightly more complex stuff like understanding of the kind of the self-reflective method that you've used, and does it kind of read well and make sense. There's that kind of quality side of things as well as the maybe more administrative side of checking. So some considerations. I just mentioned the kind of the model of self-reflection that you use. So we don't prescribe and say, there are many different models of self-reflection. I'm sure you're all aware. We don't prescribe which one you need to use, but we do suggest that you structure your self-reflection in a consistent way. So you have kind of modular ways that kind of modular parts within the form to provide self-reflection, and what we ask that you do is just to try to keep those consistent as you go through. So deal with each of those in a modular way. So you can, and I think within the way that you deal with areas as well, to try to make sure that you deal with things in a modular way within each portfolio area. Slightly confusing. So I think so. The example that I've given there is we ask you to reflect on your portfolio, your partnerships with other organisations. So you could approach that as a general kind of exploration of how partnerships have worked and what's gone well and what hasn't, but it would probably be more useful to reflect on each partnership separately, to reflect on kind of specific challenges and developments and successes. Now you might top and tail that with these are our key points, but actually I'm kind of working through some specifics in each of these areas is often useful, and that will be the case around some of the other areas that we ask you to self-reflect on too. So for example, if you've had a review undertaken by several different professional bodies over the last kind of the 2 or 3 years that we're asking, then you will probably want to self-reflect on each of those separately to an extent, and also maybe draw together the kind of the key themes as well. So we really are looking for that kind of the granular level of detail wherever you can, so that we can really understand the basis for what you're saying through your performance reporting and self-reflective exercise. But we also, that we appreciate there are going to be areas of crossover. So if there are areas of crossover, feel free to kind of refer back, and we'll be quite happy to read that submission as one submission. Supporting evidence. So I've noticed that kind of reference type links could be useful. So I mentioned there, for example, professional body assessment. If the professional body has published a report on your OT, physio, psychology provision on the professional body's website, feel free to link to that if it's relevant to us to understand your performance. But the more useful thing there would probably be to do is to give us quotes from documents, and then kind of refer where you've kind of got those quotes from, rather than saying in your reflection, as a bullet point, see page 16 of this document. Actually, provide us the relevant information from page 16 of that document and within the portfolio submission itself. So what that might look like here, this is based on the Gibbs reflective cycle. So these kind of subcategories are based on that, on the Gibbs methodology. So this is kind of an example from an from National Student Survey scores, kind of what students or learners think of the provision. So there are some challenges. Then these are the kinds of the breakdowns within that Gibbs reflective cycle methodology. Then they go to kind of developments, and those are the breakdowns there. So I've just kind of given a bit of an example there about what that might look like and how it would be useful to structure these sections within your portfolio consistently around one method of self-reflection, so that we can, when we start reading it, actually, as we get used to then the way that you are referring to and reflecting on things as you move through the portfolio. So one last area to kind of touch upon here around data points. And then I'll hopefully we should get about 15 minutes for a Q&A here as well. So data points. So what we ask you to do, education providers to do, is what we expect in terms of data points is that we rely on a kind of a regular supply of externally sourced data points wherever we can, and what that helps us to do is to understand if there are changes within the performance of your provision, really. So our normative data requirements are around the number of learners that you have, the continuation rates, so that's kind of year to year, and also across the whole provision, graduate outcomes, so where your graduates end up, what they end up doing, teaching quality, and learner satisfaction as well. So through this process, what we ask you to do is to self-reflect on those data points. I've kind of noted that data points are a part of the evidence, and it's really important that that's understood. So these are contextual for us to understand what data is saying, but then that is only ever one part of the evidence, and that's why we ask you to self-reflect on those data points. So actually, if you had an NSS score that was below a national benchmark, or you had I don't know, your continuation rates were really excellent, what we'd ask you to do is not just kind of say, well, yeah, that's what it is. We ask you to self-reflect on that, to say, we're really proud of this, we think this is a great score, we think that these things that we've done have led to this really high NSS score, or high teaching quality kind of outcomes. But actually there are some other data points that we are working on, and these are the things that we're doing to help us to address those kind of metrics, to ensure that we can address and make sure that those start to look better in the future. Now a lot of those data points that we've identified and I've talked about, we are sourcing them from external data sources wherever we can. And this is the first year we've run data into our model in this kind of level. So what we intend to do is to build upon the data points that we're using currently. But at this time, we've focused on embedding data points that are in higher education, particularly, and also there are some data points that are a bit more focused around England. So, for example, the Teaching Excellence Framework, which is an English initiative, although there are some education providers outside of England that also engage with that. And we appreciate there are some things like TEF, which is now out of date. And data points are kind of constantly changing and developing and growing, and so we're not static with this. What we want to try to ensure is that we are using data points that kind of that link back to those areas in the previous slide for each and every provider, so that we can continue to understand when we're not engaging with you through a portfolio submission. We can continue to understand how you're performing against those kinds of data points when there are, say, drops in performance, that we can then explore those with you. But what that allows us to do, relying on data points, it's particularly data points that are supplied externally, it allows us to continue to be confident with the decision making through our processes. If we were to move to a 5-year monitoring period with you. Now, having said all of that, we know that data points aren't available for every education provider. So, these external data returns, not every education provider will be included. Where there isn't a sufficient amount of data points, kind of on an ongoing basis, the maximum length of time that will allow between portfolio submissions will be 2 years. So we'll maintain that at 2 years, which is where it is, where it was in the legacy model. So that's so that we can continue to understand risks in an ongoing way when data is not available. Now, however, having said that, what we want to be able to do through this exercise with you, if you don't have those data points supplied, and if you don't, there'll be a section in your form that kind of links into this. What we'd like to be able to do with those gaps in that data is work with you to establish how you would report those data points to us, or how we might source those data points externally from you to satisfy those normative requirements that were listed on the previous slide. So if you would like us to extend your monitoring period beyond 2 years, you'll need to work with us to establish those data points and how you regularly return them through this performance review process. And again, that's something that we can work with you directly on, and will be assessed through the process along with everything else that's in the submission. So, as I said, we are looking to build on the data points. What we've done is we've gone after the data points and integrated them into what the work that we do. We've gone after the bigger, with the data points with the largest number of providers linked in and associated with them. And we've not got complete coverage across every provider with all of those data points. But then we have put this kind of process in place, I suppose, that enables us to try and establish those data points with you and the return of some data points, so that we can, work with you on that kind of longer basis. We'll need to just kind of establish that through this process. That's the intention. So what we've done in your portfolios is where they are available, we have completed data points within the relevant section, and then we've explained where those data points have come from too. So there are some data points that are subject level, for example, and there are some that are institution level. And so we've tried to explain wherever we can where those data points have come to. What we now ask you to do is, where there are gaps, supply relevant data points. And so you're not going to, if you're not within higher education, you're not going to be able to supply, or not within undergraduate higher education, I should say, you're not going to be able to supply kind of NSS scores exactly. But what we would ask that you do is to provide some information there about what your students, your learners think of your provision. So what we are asking for really is equivalent data and then reflections on that equivalent data. We also ask you to reflect on any data points that we've given to you and any that you supply yourself. And then if applicable, we ask you to complete that proposal for supplying the data points to us in the future. My example here, so as noted, really, this is where we supplied the data points if they're available. If they're not supplied, we ask you to complete them. we undertake kind of we use the benchmarks that are provided by the external data partners. Then we use that kind of data, we note that data point as well, so you can see the difference between benchmark. And then we note where that's kind of sourced from as well. And then we ask you to provide some self-reflection. Some of this, so NSS, there is a section in the earlier portfolio which is around NSS. And so we'd ask that, there may be some kind of, please refer back to the section in the earlier part of the portfolio. We then also would like you to supply any supporting information if you would like to, so you can give us that kind of document title, any documents or accessible URL, so that you can kind of make references to that support your self-reflection really in this area. Now, as I say, data, it's often an area where people, think, oh, if we've got an NSS score which is below the benchmark, or is, if we've got haven't got a TEF score, whatever it might be, then the HCPC is going to kind of trigger a specific thing, and we certainly don't. We're not doing that. So our intention with data is that it's part of the picture. It is part of the evidence that we will consider. Another very relevant part of the evidence we'll consider is what you think and what you're telling us about data. So, for example, if you had some troubling NSS scores, you picked up on those, and you'd put a load of stuff in place to try and fix those for next time and to try and make your student experience better, then that's the important thing to us. So we're not going to undertake, punitive process because some NSS scores were not great a couple of years ago, but then you've done a load of stuff about them to try and fix problems, as they were. So our intention is very much to allow us to explore areas with you as part of evidence. Okay, so next steps. What we are asked now is that, and this is kind of a key point actually for everybody, is that if you've not already agreed your deadline, you need to really move on to be able to do that as quickly as you can. Now, we have a finite amount of resources. I've said that we've had 5 education officers that will be working with you. We've got about 55 portfolios. What my team can't do is receive 10 portfolios in May, for all 50 portfolios in May, and then run through that with themselves and also with our external partners. So we essentially have slots to fill through each month. For deadlines, so we are looking to fill those kinds of slots. So if you would like, the deadline that you would like, you need to get back in touch with us as quickly as possible to arrange a deadline with us. And then the members of my team might need to negotiate around those deadlines and what they look like. But actually, we're not going to be able to facilitate everybody coming back in May time. I know that May's not convenient with some people, by the way, here as well. I know that some people would prefer earlier deadlines because June is exam season, all that sort of stuff. So I certainly would to avoid disappointment, please get in touch with your officer as quickly as possible, because we do need to get those deadlines in, and we need to hold you to those deadlines once they are there. We will then keep providing you support through the process. When you're putting your portfolio together, we'll give you support and advice. You give us your submission. We undertake that kind of documentary review and arrive at some initial findings, come to you with those findings and also how we'd like to address them through the quality activity. Undertake the quality activity, work with your stakeholders, ask you for further documentation or responses to questions, and a range of those things. And then we will come to some final outcomes. You then get the opportunity to comment on those outcomes, and those outcomes will be based around essentially whether you're performing well, and how long it should be before we next engage with you. And then we ask you to provide some observations on both of those things, and then a decision is made by our education and training committee. Now, so at a high level, it sets out kind of what your interactions with the process will look like. And from this point here, your submission to the decision should take about 4 months. What we're looking to do, our full intention here is that we turn around and have given everybody decisions by the September meeting of our ETC. So essentially having finalised everything from our perspective by the end of August, and then they go to ETC for that final decision. So thank you very much for your time today, everyone. I've just kind of listed the contacts here, but the thing that I would suggest is that you've got your named executive member, work with them, work with internal colleagues to ensure this is a successful process. Yeah, and I'd just like to thank everybody for your time. So thanks for attending today, and I hope it's been useful. Thanks, everyone.